Okay, I appreciate it's the end of the day. It's kind of the graveyard shift, so I'll try not to take too long over this. One of the things we do in this particular building is projects for various organisations. And so this little presentation is sort of an account of some of this work that we've done. But we've heard a lot about food security over the last couple of days. This is obviously an incredibly important area. It's something we clearly need to address. We need to really think hard, I think, about the sorts of food products that perhaps we're going to innovate and create in the future to address some of these particular issues. Now, we don't have control over all the pressures on the food supply chain, but there are some things I think we can actually do and contribute to this. So food security is really a troubling area, and something is going to probably get more higher in sort of consciousness as time goes on. We had the quote about UK only sort of 5 or 6 meals away from anarchy yesterday. That was an evaluation by MI6. But the other comment, which I particularly liked, was that food security is national security. So again, at government level, this is being taken very seriously, which is nice to know. Now, one of the things we can do is sort of think about the food supply chain, and the thing I usually say to people is that the consumer has immense power and influence over the supply chain. And if we're going to try and change things, if we're going to try and impact upon food security, then perhaps we shouldn't just think about sort of the start of this supply chain. We also need to think about the consumers at the end, because they do have immense power. And certainly nowadays, where we have the internet and all this sort of social media and so on, and we've heard about the power of bloggers one way or another, then we really do need to respect the consumer as well. But perhaps we can manipulate consumers in a subtle way, shall we say. A long time ago, I started life as an environmental scientist, and as I often say, my thoughts back in the day was that if I was a student, I chained myself to factory gates, I'd change the environment for the better, but what usually happened was you got chased by the police and occasionally hit by them. And really what I should have done is invented the internet and then wound up all the consumers to write interesting blogs. So we do have power. Now, in terms of product, one of the things we were asked to do was look at the use of an algal flour, a high-protein algal flour, as a replacement for egg. And using a range of students who have been here on placement, we decided to examine a range of baked goods to see if this material had any potential. We've heard lots of people talking about alternative ingredients, environmentally friendly ingredients and so on. And in particular, yesterday we had Alan Marson talking about algae. Well, I think it's all very well talking about these new interesting ingredients, but at the end of the day, someone has to eat the stuff. And so that's really what we need to do, is to see how they perform and are they edible. So we've been using this material, Algavir protein, by the company Solazyme. It's essentially chlorella, a freshwater algae. Interesting claims made around it. It's referred to as being non-allergenic. That's an interesting comment, because I vaguely remember when I did industrial microbiology as a student that one of the barriers to the use of algae was in fact the presence of materials that might be considered allergenic or have other toxic properties. If you delve deeper, non-allergenic actually refers to the fact it doesn't contain any recognised components of recognised allergens. So it's kind of stretching the concept of non-allergenic. But this material is interesting. It's got a high protein content, 63%, relatively low lipid in this particular format, and the lipid that's there is mainly unsaturated fats as well. So potentially a very healthy material. It contains pretty much all of the main amino acids that are required in a diet, and it's high in glutamate and arginine, which have potential for muscle damage and recovery from muscle damage, and so potentially of interest to athletes. The other thing as well is it contains a lot of lutein, which is why it has this kind of yellow colour. And again, lutein is a very interesting substance in terms of maybe preventing disorders like macular degeneration, something that could affect or increasingly affects the elderly. So the various students we've had here, working with my colleagues as well, tried to make various baked goods, and one was muffins. And on the left we have our egg muffin dough. So this is a muffin based on the use of egg. And on the right we have a muffin dough with 3% algae material in there as an egg replacement. And as you can see, it's a lot more yellow and it's also more viscous as well. This impacts upon the way the material is processed and also performs when baked. And what we can see here is a range of muffins containing, on the left, this is a traditional egg-based recipe. Nice bit of rising going on here. And then going towards this way, we've got some algae present, algal protein, and increasing amounts. And again, what we might notice is these haven't risen quite as much. Now, that's sort of interesting, but again, they all look reasonably edible. So that's quite nice. And again, in section, that's quite interesting as well. What we see with the traditional recipe up here is there's more air spaces. So the egg proteins have helped form this nice sort of foam, we might describe it as, with entrapped air. And this is why we've got this sort of risen product. Whereas down here with the egg replaced and a high amount of algal protein, we don't have the same internal structure. So these muffins are more dense and more compact and less air present. Now we can take things further. I mean, rather than just simply observing these things, we can apply a bit of analysis to this. And what we see in terms of analysing things like firmness is that there are differences. So using things like texture analysis, we find that, for example, the egg muffins are actually more firm than those containing the algal protein. If we look at another sort of feature, the springiness, which kind of relates more directly to the internal structure, we find that the egg muffin, the traditional recipe, has a greater springiness, whereas the algal protein substitutes have a reduced springiness. And again, this kind of relates to this internal structure. So one of the things that was tried was to introduce baking powder to kind of give to get these muffins to rise more containing the algae, and that was achieved. But again, when we look at the internal structure, there are, again, those sort of differences still seem to persist. Now, I've been told subsequently that part of this may reflect the way in which the dough was actually prepared in the first place. And I have to express my ignorance in terms of aspects such as preparation of doughs. But certainly, they look reasonably similar. And if one was put in front of you, you might say, oh, okay, that looks sort of fairly acceptable as a muffin. Again, looking at different amounts of sort of baking powder, this really didn't help very much in terms of firmness. They're in fact would appear to be softer than the traditional recipe. And again, in terms of springiness, a change, certainly an increase in springiness to an extent, but still significantly less springy than our traditional egg muffin. So from the sort of physical measurements, our algae protein-based muffins still aren't quite performing as well as a traditional egg muffin, as far as the sort of physical measurements go. The other technique that was undertaken by Jane here is an interesting piece of technology, which is an e-tongue, which I keep saying to people looks more like a fancy pH meter. But essentially this is a way of perhaps defining some of the taste properties of materials. And I'm sort of quite interested in this because as a scientist who's grown up with numbers, I like numbers. And it kind of gives us numerical values, which I feel much happier about. I guess the next question, though, is, well, what does it actually mean? Well, let's ignore that for a moment. What this e-tongue purports to do is give us this sort of breakdown in flavour in terms of various characteristics, such as saltiness, bitterness, astringency, richness, umami, and aftertaste. And from my perspective, really, what I would like is the two to kind of overlap. So we have this sort of spider diagram, and they look fairly similar. Although I guess we can say that this is our algae muffin. It has a stronger umami, meaty sort of flavour. It's richer and it's more salty. So there is definitely some sort of difference there, according to our e-tongue. And in fact, if you do a calculation of similarity based on these various parameters, you end up with a 90% similarity. So they're actually quite close in terms of their overall collective taste profile. Now, that's what the machinery says. Whether that's what humans say is perhaps more important. But what I like about that is it gives us numbers, and we can, and that's always, I think, good to an extent. So the next step, really, feed it to people. That's always important because they're going to be the customer potentially. And in general, the panellists thought that our algae muffin was softer than the egg muffin, and that kind of ties in with the physical measurements, so that's good. Now, I guess it depends whether you like your muffins hard or soft, but that's up to the customer, I guess. But in terms of overall acceptability as a muffin, the algae muffins were considered to be quite acceptable, and that's quite good. That's what we want. So that's very encouraging. What's sort of interesting is that a number of people on the panel rated our algae muffin as being very good. Neither of our muffins were rated as excellent, so perhaps we've got a bit of learning to do in terms of muffin production. And again, overall, the greater number preferred the algae muffin to the egg muffin, so that's looking promising. So algae and algal protein as an egg substitute, looking very positive in this particular baked good. The algal material has a strong yellow colour, and despite that, the panellists still quite liked their yellowy muffins. One of the key things from this, though, is that we can now potentially produce products with no egg, or even reduced egg. And either way, that's potentially interesting. Egg removal means that people with an allergy can consume it, and if we go for partial replacement, that can potentially cut down cost. And we know there's an egg shortage in the United States at the moment as a result of a disease outbreak and population, or as our food EFSA people call it, a depopulation exercise. The other thing we looked at also, just very briefly, we've done a range of baked goods, and again biscuits were attempted as well. And what we have here is increasing amounts of algal flour being used, and as you can see, a progressive increase in the yellow colour. So again, I guess it depends on how yellow you're prepared to accept your biscuit. But certainly, on balance, the 2% and 4% biscuits were very well received, despite the sort of more yellowy tinge. And so that's, again, quite promising. That sort of suggests there may be a future for the use of algal flours in these sorts of products. So that's quite interesting. I think we've got some evidence, that's quite nice, that this new material is potentially acceptable to consumers. And I think that's kind of important because, going back to our food security question, consumers do tend to look at things in terms of not just ingredients, they tend to think in terms of food as meals. And whatever we do, we've got to present things in a way that the consumer will firstly find accessible, affordable and available, but basically we've got to give them what they want. So I thought I'd just try and finish off with, it's all very well saying, let's go down the algal protein route. Really, it's got to be something that people will buy into, will accept. But just to kind of think about what we've been talking about over the last few days, this looks like a solution. But I think also we have to bear in mind that we do have a very diverse population. And if we think about in terms of nutrition, because clearly using these algal materials has a lot of opportunity, we can potentially create healthier products. And my sort of feeling is that we are actually heading down the route of food products addressing a sort of individual nutrition situation. And we've heard about changes in manufacturing, and maybe the next stage is these very sort of personalised meals in which perhaps people don't even think about what they're eating too much because the thinking is being done in terms of sort of nutritional content has been done by software. And already there's apps out there now for iPhone and so on which allow you to plan your menu, so you don't even really have to think too much about whether it's got too much salt or whatever. And I'm sure the next stage will be something along the lines that the thinking is taken away from the customer and you're simply presented with a range of menu choices. And taking things even further, well, perhaps the delivery of individualised, nutritionally balanced meals matched against your age and so on, and lifestyle is even the next stage. And we've already seen things like the Graze box and so on. But somebody said to me the other day, you might actually be better off eating the box rather than the content, because it has a higher fibre content, and as you know, we're very deficient in fibre. So, yes, I think technology has a good possibility of providing solutions. I think we need to look at new ingredients and new materials, but clearly we need to make sure that the consumer will accept them. And again, I think that based on the last few days, we can see further opportunities to make sure that we're all fed properly and with healthy materials. So I just wanted to wrap up by thanking various people, Kath Birch, Jane Fabergé, Toby Kirst, and Sharon Robinson, who provided some of the analytical work, and again the 3 students involved in that particular piece of work who were placement students through the Erasmus programme who came from a variety of French universities and were here for 3 months. So a nice little piece of work, and also I'd like to thank Alan Marston, New Food Innovation, for providing us with supplies of Algavir. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm conscious of the time, so is there time for one question, please? Neil.
2 quick ones, Graham. Sorry. 2 quick ones, Graham. Could you capitalise on the yellow colour in terms of a Maillard reaction type appearance for a baked good? That's the first one. And then when you said that your muffins were almost functioning as well as the egg replacement thing, to me that wouldn't be the question. It would be, did your algal muffins perform enough?
Okay, going back to the first question about yellowing and so on. Yes, I think if you wanted to simulate the sort of the browning reactions, there's certainly an opportunity there. So maybe some attention to some of the other ingredients to give you the right kind of colour. That might be useful. The second question, just repeat the last bit again for me, please.
The question was that you said that the egg muffin was working a little bit better than the algal muffin. For me, that's not the question. The question is, does the algal muffin function enough?
I guess the answer to that is, based on the consumer reaction, yes. If we purely looked at it from a technological measurement point of view, probably not. So I think the proof is in the eating, and as they say, and so certainly it went down well, and that's perhaps what we should consider. In a way, it kind of links back to this thing about use of textured proteins and alternative proteins, meat substitutes, and so on. Why, and again, the corn question: why are we advertising products as beef-like or chicken-like? Shouldn't we just sell them on the basis that it's corn, or some other new products? I understand the reason why there is that linkage. So one thing I didn't show was that one other thing that which went on was actually creating a very high protein-based biscuit with a view of sort of sports nutritionists, and that had a very soft texture, and that might actually be useful for people who are sporting, but also potentially for, say, the elderly or those recovering from illness. That if we can deliver a very high level of protein in a sort of an acceptable format, then maybe that's good as well. Maybe that should be considered a new standalone product in its own right.